Thank you very much, everyone. It's a great honour for me to be able to share with you about this wonderful text called the Guideline in English, the Guidelines for Learners. This is a text that was compiled 300 years ago in the 18th century. And at that time, it was designed as a children's primer, so a children's textbook, and was widely popular throughout the local schools of the Qing dynasty China. What's very interesting, of course, is that even today, it continues to be used and studied and read throughout schools, private and public schools in mainland China, but also in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Indonesia, and even Australia. In recent decades, however, this particular text, the Guidelines for Learners, has extended its readership beyond that of school-age children. It's now currently used for corporate strategy, management training, professional development, as a personal self-help book, and even as part of the education program for prison inmates in various districts of mainland China. So you can see, of course, that the readership has just expanded so widely. And, you know, this really makes us question or raise interest as to how it came to gain such reach and significance. Of course, it's very hard to estimate exactly how many people have read the Deeds of Wei. There are estimates that maybe tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions. But from what we know, there are so many different editions out there. So just a few here that you can see. Some have English translation, some are used as a picture book. There are commentaries, lectures, or it's even used or included in anthologies of other children's primers and used as a textbook. So you can see there are a vast range of different editions that are currently out there. And, you know, obviously these editions are not only available in print, but also online in digital copies and even as audiobooks. The other thing about this amazing text is that it's often distributed freely. So we can't really, you know, estimate the number of people through sales figures. But certainly this text has really become quite popular. Interestingly, this text is only very short. It's just over 1,000 characters. And if you think of it in terms of a typed Chinese characters, it fits into one A4 page. And I've just split this into two parts just so that it can fit into the PowerPoint slide. But it's actually just one A4 page. So you can see that actually the content is quite concise. So how did it come to be so popular, and what is it all about? That's what I want to talk to you about today, and, you know, really start from the very beginning. So this particular text was compiled in the 17th century by Li Yu, who was actually a teacher. So he knew and understood the needs of school-age children. But he compiled this text not as a literacy primer nor as a sort of manual for examinations, but as a more practical handbook for life skills. So skills such as personal skills, interpersonal communication skills, teamwork, problem solving, critical thinking, etc. And these were not his own ideas. These were sort of drawn from the Confucian classical scholarship. And this primer was to be a primer for the Confucian humanistic education, an education that seeks to fully develop the human potential. So that was what Li Yu had in mind. Now later, this text was edited by Jia Chunren, who was a renowned phonologist. Now, phonology, as we've heard earlier, is a specialty. So it's a study of the sounds of the Chinese language, and particularly the evolution, the function of these sounds. With this knowledge, we're able to really tap into and unearth the wisdom of these Chinese texts. So Jia Chunren, with his very comprehensive understanding of the sounds of the Chinese language, was able to rearrange this text in a way that made it more readable and, in fact, fun to read. So if we look at this page here on the PowerPoint, these pre-modern texts are read from right to left and top to bottom. So the lines are actually vertical lines. So you'll see the first, from the spacing between the characters, you can see that the phrases are made up of 3 characters. So this 3-3 arrangement gives it a very characteristic rhythm when you're reading it. But at the same time, he also ensured that there was rhyme. And in fact, Professor Zhu has actually analyzed the rhyme sequence in the Guideline, this Guidelines for Learners. And he's shown us that there's, Jia Chengren paid very careful attention to the rhyme as well, in consideration for its readability for the children and other people who are learning it. And so from a phonological perspective, it's actually very fascinating in terms of its rhyme. So you can see that the text has both rhyme and rhythm, and it makes it really fun to read. So what I'll do, for those of you who haven't read the Deeds of Wei before, I'm going to read the first 2 lines here in Chinese so you get a bit of an idea. And I'll read it a bit faster than usual so that you can get this, you can understand its rhythm. So in Chinese, it reads, 弟子规，圣人训，首孝悌，次谨信，泛爱众，而亲仁，有余力，则学文. So you can see that the 训 and the 信, as well as the 人 and the 文, they actually have that rhyme, even though the rhyme sequence, really, its actual rhyme is based on the dialect as well as the language, the sounds of the language 300 years ago. But it still retains part of it today, which makes it quite fun to read for anyone and not just children. So the other thing that Jia Chengren did was that he actually changed the title as well. So it used to be called Instructions for Children, and he changed it to Guidelines for Learners. And why did he do that? Well, first of all, this 弟子, which means learners, doesn't necessarily just refer to children. It actually refers to learners of all ages, because when we read about Confucius and his students, most of whom were of adult age, they actually, they were also called 弟子, right? So these are learners of all ages from all walks of life. But also, what are they learning? And this is the Gui here. They weren't just any instructions. When we look at the original meaning for the character Gui, it actually means a compass for drawing circles, which is pictured here. And I'm sure that many of us in primary school have used a compass before, and you'll know, of course, that when you use it, you're able to draw perfect circles of all sizes. Now, the compass and the carpenter's square were very important tools in ancient China for this idea of measurement. And therefore, this character, Gui, also had an extended meaning of measure or a standard, right? And so when you look at the form of the character, to its philology, you can see that it's made up of a left and a right part. And the left part, in this particular context, refers to a person of excellence, and the right part refers to their views or their insights. Now, if we think about it, a person who's an expert, who's a specialist, their views would make the gold standard, would be the highest quality, and therefore it gives rise to this particular translation of guidelines. So they're not just any instructions, and it's not just for children. They are guidelines for learners. But this begs the question, what are we learning? And therefore we need to look inside the text. So the foreword that I just read out, the first 2 lines of the Guidelines for Learners, can be translated as such. But actually, these lines were actually derived from a passage in the Analects, in the first chapter of the Analects section. what I have in blue here, in the blue font, is actually, you can see the identical part of both of these passages. It's almost identical, isn't it? Except for the very beginning. So on the right-hand side, the passage from the Analects begins with Confucius said, whereas the Guidelines for Learners begins with the fact that this text is comprised of the instructions of sages. Now, is there some sort of inconsistency here? Well, actually, no, because Confucius was revered as the utmost sage and is still celebrated as this utmost sage today. But also, Confucius himself told us that he was not a creator, he was simply a transmitter, in the sense that these ideas were not his own, and he was merely articulating the thoughts and the philosophies of those who had come before him, the sages that had come before him. And we know, of course, that Confucius was really the first thinker in Chinese history to articulate a system of thought, drawing from those who had come before him in a way that could be passed down to posterity. And therefore, when the Guidelines for Learners talks about the instructions of sages, it's very much consistent with this passage in the Analects. Now, the keywords in the foreword here then become the structure of the text itself, as you can see. I've included a translation from the Pure Land translation team. So the keywords are slightly different from the previous slide, but they've made it more accessible to the general public, and it's not as specialist in terms of those sinological terms. So you can see that the keywords here become the 7 chapters of the text, and I'd like to go through the different chapters with you in a way, because the structure of the text is also very special. There's an order to this. So first, it begins with respecting and loving our parents at home. And this is very important from the Confucian perspective, because the idea of family reverence or filial piety in Chinese, xiao, is fundamental to human life, in the sense that what happens at home, the parent and child relationship, is where we form our cognitive, emotional, social, intellectual, moral skills. They're sort of the foundation of those skills for life. And being able to be mindful of the love and the care of our parents, and being able to think about them, is actually then the foundation for how we learn to empathize and care for everyone else for the rest of our lives. So this is something that was very important, and therefore takes foremost place as the first chapter. The second chapter then is interacting with others away from home. So when children grow up, they go to school, then later we go to work, etc. We have more different relationships than those just within the family. And so this is about how we extend the skills that we learn within the family to those outside the family. How do we relate to people? These interpersonal skills. And the idea that, how we relate to our siblings, later when we're in the community, when we encounter those who are more senior or more junior than us, we can also see them in the same way as perhaps our siblings. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 is about looking after ourselves in terms of our physical health and well-being, but also the environment around us, which is very important when you're starting out in life. Being cautious in your daily life, and being aware of the environment. The fourth chapter is then being mindful of our different relationships, and this value or virtue of trustworthiness was characteristic of friendship from the Confucian perspective. The idea of friendship was, on a broad sense, relationships that we had outside the home, except for the sort of employer-employee relationship. So this trustworthiness helps us then think about how to interact with those in the community, in other areas of our life. And we'll go back to this in a little while. Chapter 5 then changes the focus a bit, because as you might have noticed, the first 4 chapters are preoccupied with ourselves, our virtues, our relationships around the home or outside the home, looking after ourselves, etc. But chapter 5 is then, well, let's think about and turn our attention outwards, not just to the people around us, but to all beings. So there's this idea of becoming big-hearted and thinking about all beings. And then the last 2 chapters are about our learning, and the fact that learning is not simply in text, but also from the people around us. We have to be able to learn from those who are kind and virtuous. The final chapter talks about the arts. Now, the arts here doesn't refer to the fine arts. The arts here refers to sort of the culture in general, and even those professional skills that we need for our career. Now, of course, in the pre-modern China, the kinds of careers that people were thinking about were careers in government service. So the arts or the learning involved sort of classical scholarship, the textbook learning. And you can see how this comes last in terms of this idea of all the skills that we need in life. And so in terms of the structure, you can see that chapter 7, those professional skills, they are just one out of the many skills that we need. And you can see that there are so many skills that are touched upon in the other chapters that makes this kind of humanistic education quite holistic. So we're thinking about the whole person here, humanistic being the human-centered approach to learning, and human-centered being something that deals with meaningful interactions with others in our lives, because no human is an island. We all exist or within a web of different relationships. And so humanistic education is about how we make the most of those relationships and benefit others and also the environment. So it's quite holistic. And chapter 7, which is the arts or these professional skills, are sort of learnt in tandem with the others, with this kind of virtue, with this understanding of developing our character as well. So, interestingly, Venerable Master Ching Kung, who, as we know, was one of the founders of the Academy of Sinology, explained the significance of this text. And we know, of course, that Venerable Master was a world leader in multi-faith and multicultural harmony. But this kind of harmony, he believed, was not based on empty words, but on a mutual learning of the foundational texts of the various cultures and faiths. In terms of the Chinese culture, he delved into the 3 main traditions, that of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. And he sought to find texts that were foundational in the sense that they could be practical and accessible for people who, modern lifestyles, people who are non-specialists. They didn't have to be sinologists, but something that they could use in their daily life and, carried the essence of that tradition. So he identified 3 texts, which he called the 3 roots. So for Confucian tradition, he identified the Deeds of Grave, the Guidelines for Learners. For the Taoist tradition, he identified the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao, in Chinese, Tai Shan Gan Yin Tian. For Buddhism, the Sutra on the Way of the 10 Virtuous Conducts, Shi Shan Ye Dao Jing. And so he believed that these texts held the core of the essence of the different traditions. And uses a very great analogy. He says, well, if the entire philosophy and the literature of these texts could be depicted through the metaphor of a tree, well, these texts would be the roots. In other words, they're the beginnings, but they're also the foundation. And just like how the roots need to be nourished for the tree to grow, our understanding of these traditions, our practice of the traditions, develop the more we learn and practice these various texts, including the text that we're talking about today, the Deeds of Grace. So the texts were the foundation, the roots, because they were accessible, they were concise, easy to understand, and also practical, something that you could just use right here, right now. And I want to take some passages from the Deeds of Grace to help you understand this idea of how practical it really is. So this is from the 4th chapter about being trustworthy. So here it says, some people like to gossip and comment about the faults or good points of others, but if something does not concern us, we should not get involved. Now this would be relevant not only to school-age children, but also even at work, in the workplace. It's sort of advising us not to get involved in work politics, which sometimes, is really a source of a lot of stress and anxiety. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't understand others, understand the strengths and the weaknesses of others, because we need to work with them. But it tells us how to deal with that, how to deal with our emotions. So it says, when we see the goodness of others, we should encourage ourselves to learn from them, rather than, be jealous or be annoyed, because even if we're far behind them, we will gradually achieve. If we work hard now, it's just a matter of time before we also have the same success and achievements. And then what if we see the faults or the weaknesses of others? Well, instead of criticizing them, instead of gossiping about them, we should reflect on our own behavior. If we've made the same mistakes, we have the same faults and correct it. And if we don't have these faults, we should be cautious and not make the same mistake. So it gives us, a constructive way of thinking about the qualities, whether it's the positive or the negative qualities of others. And if you think about it, this is all under the banner of trustworthiness, which, at a superficial level, we think of trustworthiness simply as, keeping our word. But actually, on a deep level, it's about sincerity. It's about being genuine in our relationships with others and how we treat others. And this genuineness is in not just how we behave towards them, but in our thoughts. What happens when we judge them? Well, if we see the faults, then we have to reflect on ourselves. And that helps us maintain sincerity and ultimately trustworthiness. So, when we go back to that sort of Analects passage, had all these different virtues, being cautious, being respectful to our elders, fraternity, family reverence. But all of these seem quite abstract without, specific instructions. And so you can see that what the Guidelines for Learners does is that it makes these profound concepts like trustworthiness, it reinterprets them as guidelines for living, for the art of living. And so that's why Venerable Master Ching Kung called these texts the very roots for becoming a sage, the very first step to becoming a sage. A sage being someone who has achieved moral excellence, someone who's not only able to uncover their innate virtues, but also help others reach their potential as well. Now, he explained that, so why call these texts the roots? Well, because just like a plant without roots, it won't survive very long. And for our learning and our practice without these texts, then our practice would be unsustainable. And so that whole idea of the significance of the text is included this extract here to just sort of bring it home. So this is an extract from one of Venerable Master's lectures in which he explains himself in a bit more detail. He says that some professors asked why he advocated the guidelines for learners when, there are so many other texts in the Confucian tradition, like the 13 classics. But he says, think about this. Let's put it on a balance. On the one side, we have the guidelines for learners, the Deeds of Way, with just 1,000 characters. But on the other side are all the other texts, the 13 classics, including even the complete library of the 4 branches, which is the largest collection of texts in Imperial China. So you have those two, but they actually weigh the same. And why is that? This weighting is more the value. So their value is the same. He explains that the purpose of these texts, all of the texts, all the different classics, etc., were about our learning. And this learning, there was a particular process. First of all, erudition, so reading widely, but then questioning and understanding the gaps in our knowledge, asking questions so that we can further relate to the material, and then digesting the material, so thinking about what we've learned, and then being able to distinguish what's right and what's wrong, how these different materials come together. But ultimately, the final step is practice. And without that practice, all this learning amounts to nothing, in the sense that we don't benefit in our lives. And therefore, the guidelines for learners is really a distillation of all the different ideas and philosophies of the Confucian tradition, but from a practical point of view. How do we actually do it in our lives? How do we actually put it to use in our lives? And therefore, that's why Bernard Master explains that that's why their value is, the significance of those texts is so amazing. And that is why he explains that this is really the very first step, but also the foundation to becoming a sage. So I'll end there today. I look forward to your questions, and I hope that in the future we can explore this more on the course together. Thank you very much.